Hey everyone, this is Bunny, and today we're going to talk about how to thin your paints. Because a lot of paint brands, when they first come out of the tube or out of the bottle, depending on what you're using, they need to be thinned down to a workable consistency. A paint that is too thick is going to hide all the detail on your miniatures, and you're not going to be able to see all the little crevices and all the little details that pop out on your miniatures. So you do need to be working with a thinner paint than some of the paints that you will see. So we are going to talk about acrylic paints first because that's probably what you're using. Very few people use oil to paint their miniatures. So we're going to talk about acrylic paints. Now, I have recently refilled my palette with new colors because I'm starting a new project. And I did this last night. So what I did, to give you an example, is I took this color here. This is my yellow-green Castle Arts. And I put it in my palette and I left it. So I'm just going to squirt a little bit of fresh color there. Now that is obviously not as thinned down as this one. They're the same paint from the same tube, and I haven't added any water to this yet. So if you are using a wet palette, what you're probably going to want to do is take your acrylic paints and add them to your wet palette, put the lid on your wet palette, and wait a few hours. Because the moisture from your wet palette, remember, your wet palette has water in here. That's the point. So the moisture from your wet palette ends up kind of making this a humidity chamber, and it does seep into your paint. So if you add water, now I have added water. I added water to this one. This is a silver paint. I added water to this one when I first put it in to show you what happens if you add water preemptively. Look at how thin this is, which is fine if that's what you're going for. But if you wanted a regular texture, look at how thin this paint is. That is really thin. You can hardly see that show up on camera. It flows off the brush just fine, so it's not thick, but it's hardly there. This is a really thin paint. So I added water to demonstrate how many times you would have to go over that to get it to really show up. As opposed to, let me just rinse my brush, a paint like this, okay? There you go, decent coverage in one stroke, right? Decent coverage. And now I'm going to rinse my brush again. Take some of this one. Again, decent coverage in one stroke. But look at that silver. So I added that water, and that paint became way too thin. So if you are adding water to your wet palette, some people use their wet palettes dry, but if you are using your wet palette as a wet palette, then what you want to do is let your paint sit in the humidity of that wet palette with the palette closed for a little while to see what the consistency, because look at this, this is quite a bit thicker and quite a bit harder to work with. You get a much thicker line. So you want to leave your paint in there and let it kind of absorb the humidity that it will absorb from the wet palette. So don't add water right away, because you will get this runny paint that is not going to really help you very much. I'm going to have to add more paint to reconstitute that, or just ignore that pile and start a new pile of silver. So these different consistencies of paint are really kind of personal preference. This is not going to work unless you're doing a very light top coat and you want all your undercolors to shine through. But these three consistencies, I don't like how thick this green is. That's why I let it thin down in the palette. But these two, this beige is a little bit, or actually it's toasted marshmallow technically. But this toasted marshmallow is quite a bit thinner. Not quite a bit, but thinner enough that I notice the difference in consistency between the toasted marshmallow and the yellow-green. So the exact consistency is kind of up to you. What do you like to work with? I like to work with something that is a little bit thicker, but not thick like this guy. So this guy here is too thick. I like to work with the consistency of this green. That's my favorite consistency. I can use this one. That'll work too. But it's really personal preference. Some people like to work with a slightly thicker paint, and some people like to go with a slightly thinner paint. So it really is a personal preference. So just to give you an example of how these go on, I'm just going to take a thicker brush. This is one of my tints. It's going to end up this toasted marshmallow color. If you have a thinner paint like this, okay, I'm going to have to do 2 coats. But the important thing is this isn't hiding the detail. So if we go over here, even before it dries, I'm not going to bother painting the hide because the hide's going to be a different color. But even before it dries, you can see that those crevices are highlighted. Okay? You can see that. Now it's going to need 2 coats. A lot of time, thinner, lighter colors need 2 coats, especially over a black primer. That's why some people use white. I use black. But I'm obviously going to have to go over it. However, this consistency of paint will give me kind of it shows the detail I need it to show while still giving me coverage. So with thinner paints or with lighter colors, it's not uncommon to have to do 2 coats, and that's fine. This isn't actually a painting tutorial, but it just bugs me when I don't go all the way over. So you absolutely want to make sure that you can go over it again if you need to, but you don't want your paint so thick that it covers up these details. I still want to be able to see the detail, the stitching detail on the tent, even though I'm not painting that stitching a different color. You still need somewhere for your wash to sink into. Okay, so the washes sink into the grooves, and if you've hidden all those grooves with a whack ton of paint, then it's not going to be able to highlight those very distinctive colors and those very distinctive markings on your miniature. So you want to make sure it's not too thick, because if it's too thick, it's going to sink into these grooves and they're going to go away. And that won't be any fun for me at all. So I'm just going to grab one of my, sit him there so he can dry a little bit. But you definitely want to be highlighting those grooves, because I'll just grab the other tent. I have 2 tents. So you can see the difference. I'll just turn this one around so there's the same orientation. But you can see that that paint is allowing those grooves and those details to pop, whereas thicker paint will not allow them to stand out and you'll lose them. So make sure you're not working with a super thick paint. That's not going to help you. But you also don't want to work with a super thin paint. If I started painting this on stuff, it's just not going to show up. It's like hardly there at all. It's coming off my brush just fine, because you do want your paint to flow off your brush. You want the paint to come off your brush at the lightest touch, but you still want to have some opacity. So you still want to have some coverage when you run that down. Now, some people like to test their paints on the back of their hand. I do not like to do that because, first of all, the paint irritates my skin. I have sensitive skin. But also because I don't find it gives you a really good idea of how opaque that paint is. I literally just like to use the liner on my wet palette. I find that you can really see what is too thin, what is too thick. But everyone has a different preference. If you want to use the back of your hand, use the back of your hand. If you want to use a piece of your wet palette, use that. But either way, you do want to make sure that you are testing to see if it's the consistency you want and if it's giving you the coverage you want. Now, obviously, if you want a paint that doesn't cover as well, so you're kind of just doing a bit of a top coat, you might thin it down more. You want a paint that covers more, you might work with a thicker paint. But you do want to make sure you're working with a consistency that is pleasing to you. Remember, the videos on this channel are all about painting miniatures for your own personal use that you like. So if you don't like working with a thicker paint and you just want to do multiple coat, that is loud. Sorry, I don't understand why people are crazy and turning things on while I'm recording. Thank you. Anyway, that's not the point. That's not the point. We're not going to worry about that. But, shh. Thank you. At least turn it down. Sorry, there's multiple people doing things in the same room. Anyway, not the point. But if you do want to work with your paints that are thinner, you can just do multiple coats. And maybe you're happy with multiple coats. And that's fine too. A lot of people they would rather do a thinner coat and then come back and do another coat. And I don't necessarily love doing 3 or 4 coats. I'll do 2. But again, it's personal preference. So if you want a thinner paint, go ahead and use a thinner paint, but don't use something this thin. This won't cover at all. This is fine for accents and stuff if you're just brushing a little bit of paint on and you don't really care that much, but you definitely want to be working with one of these 2 consistencies when you're doing your regular painting, just because this isn't going to cover. You're going to spend all your time trying to cover this, which is fine if that's what you want. It's not fine if you don't want to spend all day covering your miniature. As for oil paints, because someone is going to ask, most people painting miniatures do not use oil paints. They instead use acrylic paints like we are using here. But if you are using oil paints, that's fine. You might prefer oil paints. You can't thin them with water. If you need to thin out your oil paints, you want to get yourself some linseed oil. And yes, I have linseed oil because I do sometimes work with oil paints. You definitely need linseed oil if you're going to thin out those paints, just because water and oil don't mix. So if you try to thin out your oil paints with water, you're just going to end up with a sloppy mess that's not getting anywhere. So if you do use oil paints instead, you're going to do the same thing as we did with the acrylic paints and water, but you're going to use a linseed oil because that mixes better. And why am I specifying linseed oil? It's because some oils are oils that do not help your paint dry. Okay, so if you mix your oil paints with a coconut oil, your paint will never actually dry. So you need a drying oil like a linseed, which helps your paint dry, instead of mixing it with like a vegetable oil or an olive oil. Those will never dry. Because if you think about it, those oils, if you spill them on your counter, they just sit there. They don't ever do anything. 3 days later, you're still going to have oil on your counter. You need a paint, an oil that dries to mix in with your paint. So if you are using oil paints, make sure you are using a linseed oil. It is just more helpful and will not separate your paints, and it will not keep your paints from drying once you put them on your miniature. But again, most people are going to use acrylic paints like I do most of the time. Some miniatures get oil paints. I will cover using oil paints on your minis in a different video, but for now I just wanted to talk about how to thin your paints. And remember to put them in your wet palette, cover the wet palette up, and wait and see how they thin out naturally in the natural humidity of your wet palette, because that's really important. Anyway, that is about it for today. I hope you'll be back with us next time. Bye!